Hi, my name is Dr. Felucia. I'm a licensed psychologist and welcome to Skill Set Counseling. Today, I'm going to be discussing the topic of the us versus them mentality that occurs in spiritually abusive environments or amongst spiritual abusers. Okay, so I'm sure you're asking, what is this us versus them mentality? And what that is, it's a very strong and very strict separation that occurs between the environment and the outside world, right? And I'm going to explain what this is not. So, in any sort of spiritual community, it's normal to differentiate oneself and one's community from the outside world or from other people who don't necessarily adhere to the spiritual beliefs. When it looks healthy, there's a healthy respect for other people. There's an expectation that, look, even though this group or this community is not part of my environment, I'm going to relate to them respectfully and harmoniously. But in spiritually abusive environments, others are demonized, right? The outside world is looked at as something to be feared. It's looked at as just base, horrible, and there's a lot of fear of them or of others who aren't part of that spiritual community. A lot of that fear occurs through indoctrination, just talking about, if you do anything or seek any help outside this group, something bad is going to happen to you, things like that. And so there's a very strict separation. And when that happens, it serves to isolate those who are in the spiritually abusive environment. It causes them to be dependent on the spiritually abusive environment for several needs. And because of that strong dependence, there is control. Control is gained. So if you think about three things: isolation, dependence, and control. Those are the three things that happen. Now, again, in spiritual and healthy spiritual environments, in-house services are available. They can or cannot be available. That's not necessarily a mark of a spiritually healthy environment. But in these environments, providing things like counseling, education, financial or benevolent services is not necessarily a bad thing. It's looked at more as like a convenience for those in the environment, but they're not mandated to use it. So it's one thing to have counseling services available by qualified professionals in a spiritual environment, but then to tell people, if you seek services outside of this, you're bad or you're going to get inferior services. That's something that's pretty common in spiritually abusive environments. And so there's that fear of others. It's us versus them. We have the best services. If you go outside the environment, they're going to taint you. Things like that. Another example of this you can see is when people have some talents and they're told, well, they have to use the talents only for that spiritual community. Whether it's music or education, anything. If they are made to feel afraid or ashamed to use those talents in any other way, that's a form of control. Okay, I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like. So in a spiritually abusive environment, there was an incident where a woman was being abused by her husband. Her and her kids were being abused by her husband, and she was told she should not get outside help. They told her that the secular police system and the secular everything was meant to destroy the family. And they told her that if she called the police, they would send her to a women's shelter. They were run by evil feminists whose only goal was to break up the family. Okay. And so they told her, you need to get counseling services with us. And to me, it seemed like the intent behind that was control. The people who were running the counseling services gave her advice that was harmful. They were more interested in her staying married than having a healthy marriage and her being safe. And so it really seemed to come from this place of, you need to have this perfect family image and we need to have this perfect spiritual community image. And this happens quite frequently in spiritually abusive environments. And so because of this, she was isolated. So the first step was isolation, right? She was told she shouldn't tell anybody about it. She couldn't call the police. And then if she was told that if she did, she would be in spiritual danger, just all these very very painful and very spiritually laden threats. Okay. So because of that, she became dependent on this spiritually abusive environment for everything. And because of this, they ultimately were able to control her. Okay. So in summary, the spiritually abusive environment holds an us versus them mentality. Okay. Those who are outside the spiritually abusive environment are them, and they're viewed with suspicion. They're often viewed as incompetent, having evil motives, and people are shamed or sometimes even prevented for seeking help from them. And one thing about spiritually abusive environments is that many times they don't need to tell people, don't do this, or you can't do this. They'll say, well, you can do it, but your spiritual future is in danger. They use a lot of shaming, weaponizing of language, and even isolation. So someone could say, okay, I'm going to, but it's going to cost them a lot because they're shunned from other people if they break the rules. Okay. So people are often shamed and strongly discouraged from seeking help or doing anything outside the spiritually abusive environment. And this creates control and abuse through isolation and dependence. So if you can remember three things from this us versus them, it causes isolation, dependence, and then control. So if you're interested in learning more about spiritual abuse or getting help for either identifying it or recovering from it, go to my website, skillsetcounseling.com, and book your free consultation. And if you or someone a loved one, are in a spiritually abusive situation, get help immediately. I have resources in the description box. All right. May you have a wonderful day filled with peace and joy. Bye-bye.